Alright, let's discuss the way female characters are visually portrayed in superhero comics. Normally, feminist arguments of this nature come from a moral position, i.e., these typical depictions are sexist and dehumanizing. That's true, and a conversation worth having, but I thought I'd take a different approach to this topic. The way female characters in superhero comics are typically portrayed is bad storytelling, pure and simple. Take the particularly egregious example of Stephanie Brown. This character, once called Spoiler and briefly an inheritor of the legacy of Robin, was tortured and murdered by the supervillain Black Mask. Now, this story point is problematic for a number of reasons, related to Gail Simone's famous Women in Refrigerators essay, but we'll put that aside for now. So, okay. You have this heroic character being tortured. That's the story they're telling. This should be sad or horrifying. We should be feeling empathy for Spoiler and a hatred for the evil of Black Mask. So what does the art show? Well, shows her splayed out in a sexy pose. A scene of degrading torture and murder should not bring to mind sexiness. That's the visuals acting in direct opposition to the mood, emotions, etc., what the scene is supposed to be about. That's bad storytelling. Now, like I said, this is an egregious example, but this sort of story art disconnect due to the need to constantly up the sexiness factor of female characters is pervasive in the genre. There's nothing wrong with sexy art, and I'll repeat that for the disingenuous comic skaters in the audience. There's nothing wrong with sexy art. And you're not wrong or evil for liking art like that either. I personally am a big fan of Adam Hughes, Amanda Connor, Terry Dodson, and a host of other pin-up-y superhero artists, even though some are problematic in some ways. But there is a time and a place for this sort of thing. And many artists don't seem to realize this. Seriously, not every single shot of a female character has to be drawn to maximize sex appeal. A superheroine should be able to fight without improbably contorting herself to show off her boobs and butt in the exact same shot. This is a really common pose in comics, and although it's possible for some people to make it, it's ridiculous in any battle context. This, again, is bad storytelling. Let's talk about costumes then. I'm not of the opinion that superhero costumes have to be completely practical. Capes make no sense, for example. And there's been a trend in superhero comics in the last few years to draw every costume as some sort of hyper-realistic paramilitary uniform with just a few superhero trappings. I hate this attempt to bring the movies into the comic sphere. Movies are movies and comics are comics. What works in one medium doesn't necessarily transfer to another. And I pity the poor artists who have to come in and draw all the seams and zippers and buckles that clutter up these designs. That said, even with the acknowledgement that practicality isn't necessarily a complete concern, there is a clear double standard in the way male superheroes and female superheroes are dressed that go beyond real-life cultural differences in how the two sexes are socialized to dress. Look at Jim Lee's redesign of Huntress that I believe was introduced in the Hush storyline in the 2002-2003 era. She used to look like this. And suddenly she looked like this. A big belly window for a character that had actually been shot in the stomach in a prior storyline. Large, unprotected areas for a non-powered, street-level superhero. Doesn't even fit her personality as a Catholic and a hardline anti-mob crusader. A costume should reflect what a superhero is, their personality, their powers, or lack thereof in this case, and so on. This is just sexiness for the sake of sexiness. It's bad storytelling and bad characterization. Now let's move on to a thorny issue, Power Girl. I personally like Power Girl's costume, honestly. I think it fits her brassy personality, and as a Kryptonian, usually anyway, it's complicated. She's invulnerable to bullets and such, so practicality isn't really a concern. There are certainly feminists in comics who disagree with this assertion, but I'm not alone here. Check out this ancient essay by the blogger Ragnell that I quite liked. That said, my defense of Peach's costume can be turned around to justify some pretty poor designs. Star Sapphire here uses force fields, so protection isn't necessarily a factor. The costume is actually energy created by her ring, meaning wearability isn't a factor. And her powers are connected with the emotion of love and therefore lust, so it even almost works for her personality. It's still a god-awful costume though, and it's telling that a few male members of the Starfire Corps were drawn in much more dignified costumes. This costume thing bugs me because it robs certain characters of having unique personalities. What's special about Emma Frost, a character who uses her looks and sexuality to her advantage, if every character looks and dresses like her? Here's another issue. The dearth of body types and faces for female characters. Men get a variety of body types. Spider-Man doesn't look like Captain America, who doesn't look like Thor, who doesn't look like the Hulk. There are thin men, beefy men, even monstrous men. But women are pretty much drawn the same, no matter what. Even supposed exceptions, like the usually small-chested Kitty Pryde of the X-Men, is sometimes drawn as indistinguishable from any other female character. Check out this cover by Frank Cho. That, right there, is supposed to be Kitty Pryde. Ridiculous. Even if your aim is to make female characters attractive at all times, this whole thing is a very narrow definition of attractive. Many artists simply draw the same woman over and over and over again, only differentiating them by way of costume or hair color. Even looking at the most conventionally attractive women in the world, they are not clones of one another. It's easy to instantly tell Christina Hendricks apart from Karen Gillan, despite them having the same hair color, or Christina Hendricks and Kat Dennings, despite them having similar body types. This parade of female duplicates in comics is also bad storytelling. Makes for muddled, confusing reading when you can't tell the characters apart. I've had this exact problem on many occasions. The sameness is carried to ridiculous extremes when beauty standards, which are often based on racial biases, are imposed on female characters of color. The native African superhero Vixen was portrayed by Ed Benes, and whoever colored this, as indistinguishable from a white woman during the early 2000s Justice League of America book. Again, this is weird, guys. I hear your objections to this feminist line of thinking on this whole topic. Men are sexualized too. Are they though? Are they really? I mean, in any real numbers? And do you really think anyone gets turned on by this? This sort of brings us into male gaze theory, and I know that will cause some of you to shut off your rational thinking, but let me try to explain it in simple terms. Essentially, in most media, men are subjects, i.e. they're depicted in such a way that the audience is meant to see themselves in these characters, while women are frequently objects, i.e. they're there for the viewing pleasure of the presumed straight male audience. Now, there are a few artists like Chris Anka or Nicholas Scott known for renderings of sexy men, but again, they're very few in number, and in the case of these two at least, they're knowledgeable about the medium enough that they usually don't let beefcake get in the way of storytelling. And there's often an outcry when men are in any way perceived to be actually sexualized. This Justice Society of America cover by Alex Ross, featuring the character Citizen Steel, received a massive backlash from male fans when it was solicited because it supposedly focuses on his crotch too much. The area of the cover was toned down to appease them when it actually was released. Yet this and this and this were allowed to go to the market unchanged. Now, nothing I've discussed here is universal. It's just pervasive. There are many mainstream female-led comic books that depict women in ways that are non-sexualized or non-conventional. One example is the recent Squirrel Girl series with cartoony, expressive art by Erica Henderson. The comic skaters hate the art on this series for some reason, though. Whatever. The sex object way of depicting female characters in superhero books is still very common, though. It's a crutch many artists use that then becomes a hindrance to their ability to tell compelling, interesting stories with compelling and interesting characters. Comics as a medium is largely about telling stories with words and images. And when the words and images are actively working against each other, it's, well, a bad use of the medium.